Great. Well, we're going to go ahead and get started. I see myself spotlighted, so that's a good signal. Welcome, everyone. We're excited to have this conversation, a much needed conversation, and judging by the numbers joining, this is something that all of you are interested in hearing about. I am Jacqueline Chun. I'm the Associate Director of the Center for Strategic Partnership and am a executive committee member of the LA Partnership for Early Childhood Investment. And a little bit, just very briefly about both organizations. The LA Partnership for Early Childhood Investment is a public-private partnership. We're focused on systemic change impacting our youngest citizens 0 to 5 and their families here in Los Angeles County. And similarly, the Center for Strategic Partnerships, we are housed within the CEO of LA County and also have housed in Southern California Grantmakers, also a public-private partnership transforming systems that serve children, youth, and families here across LA County. I want to begin by just thanking all of our speakers. We have a really great lineup of speakers and our moderator today. We know that this is a important conversation. We hear the news and see the news changing every day about the changes at the federal level that then trickle down to state and local. And the partnership really focuses on education to lead, as well as investments and leading the sector. So this is an education for action effort. There will be opportunities that we will talk about later in the program for how philanthropy can help, where you can plug in and support some of the impacts that our speakers will be talking about. We brought two sectors together around the early childhood education 0 to 5 population and the child welfare population. This was a unique opportunity because we know that both populations intersect across our region, and so the impacts at the federal, state, and local levels will impact all across 0 to 5 and child welfare. I'm going to now take a minute to introduce Sonia Campos Rivera. She is also a executive committee member of the LA Partnership and the senior vice president of policy and public affairs at Unite LA here in Los Angeles. And she is going to moderate our conversation today and introduce our other speakers. Thank you so much, Sonia.
Thank you, Jacqueline, for the warm welcome. And yes, welcome everybody. We're so happy to see everyone join us today in this very timely, urgent conversation that I hope creates a spark of action among all of us. But before we start that conversation, as Jacqueline mentioned, I serve as a Senior VP of Education Policy at Unite LA. Unite LA is an organization working to improve the lives of historically marginalized communities by promoting economic mobility for children, families, youth across LA and California, and even across the nation. We closely monitor policies and investments that will improve our cradle through career systems. So we keep a really close eye on conversations that are taking place and try to understand how they're going to impact our communities. And of course, right now, there is just so much going on. And as Jacqueline mentioned, in addition to being part of the Unite LA team, I am a proud member of the LA Partnerships Executive Committee, which is doing some amazing work. And I'm just so glad that we're in partnership with the Center for the Strategies and SoCal Grantmakers as well. So I am very honored to help facilitate this conversation made up of a dynamic group of speakers here today. These speakers come with a depth of not only knowledge, but a sense of understanding that can help guide actionable items for us across more on a local level. So we are really looking forward to talking about the new climate that we're in, with many unknowns, but a clear understanding of the existing and future challenges for communities we have worked so hard to strengthen. I will say, I think it is important to call out that because of the support of many of you here today, working parents, legal guardians have access to quality childcare, access to quality healthcare, regardless of legal status, critical services for foster children and opportunity youth, access to higher education for first generation. And we've even worked on improving children living in deep poverty in the last years. I can go on and on highlighting the impact of your investments, our partnership and collaboration we've had in communities. And I don't mean to get too personal here, but on my personal and professional journey is one that is a testament of what opportunities can look like when we promote equity and EDI for first generation students. And clearly the need is still there. So here we are today. We're facing very difficult times where we can't help and feel our decades worth of work are being jeopardized. And it's my hope that after today's conversation, we will walk away with not only an understanding of the daunting realities that we are facing and will face, but more importantly, I'm hoping that there's a sense of understanding of the role that we can each play to fight back in partnership and protect the progress we have made and need to continue to make for thousands of families with young children who desperately seek an opportunity to thrive. So, with that, it is now my pleasure to introduce our distinguished panel of speakers. I truly encourage you to look at the full bios. They're absolutely impressive. I'm not going to read them all. I'm just going to read top lines so we can get into the conversation. So our first speaker is Shannon Rudisill, who is the first executive director of Early Childhood Funders Collaborative. Under her leadership, ECFC is pursuing a strategy of growth and strategic engagement with partners across philanthropy to build capacity for supporting policies and practices that help young children and their families thrive. Next is Monique Ramos. Monique is a partner at California Strategies and Advocacy, also known as CalStrats, where she provides clients with strategic insights regarding state budget and the legislative process and specialized policy expertise. Monique manages multiple facets of a comprehensive government affairs program, ranging from federal and state policy initiatives, external stakeholder engagement, and fiscal policy. And Martine Singer is a veteran of LA's nonprofit sector, excuse me. Martine comes with extensive nonprofit management experience and a passionate commitment to improving the lives of children in LA's most underserved communities. As president and CEO of Children's Institute, she oversees one of the region's oldest and largest child and family organizations. Again, I encourage you to go into the bios and read more on each of our speakers today to learn more. So Shannon, let's go ahead and start with you. Obviously, there's lots going on, and I feel like states are paying extra close attention to federal budget discussions to prepare for those ripple effects on state budgets. Please walk us through what is being proposed, what you're hearing, and just your thoughts.
Thanks, Sonia. It's wonderful to be with you today, and I really appreciate the invitation from our colleagues in Southern California. I just had the privilege of being out there at a meeting with Hilton Foundation. I see some of you here. So the first thing I'll say is I am a policy wonk. I spent many years in the federal government. I see a lot of government colleagues on the phone, and I'm now working in a philanthropic context. And the reason I'm saying that is because I'm trying to bring these two things together to make sense of what's happening. And I have 10 minutes to talk a little bit about what's in this bill. And I want to really underscore that the first thing you're going to think is, why does she not have like slides and bullet points? And so for each of the things we're going to talk about today, there are like entire think tanks with teams like pouring through and modeling the effects of what's happening in DC right now. And we can send out links, but you also have in California amazing partners and advocates and think tanks. I see some of them in the chat who are translating these things and how they'll affect you, and we can send those. In the role I'm in right now, I'm drawing on what those folks are doing and trying to like keep it to the top line for people like the that I'm working with now and in the role I'm in now to think about what does this mean for our grantees or for our public-private partnerships where we don't have to know every detail, but we need to kind of see how it affects our work. And so I'm going to be talking at more that level to give you a sense of what's going on in now like 9 minutes. So one thing that's making this time really overwhelming is that we have an unprecedented mix of administrative actions that, we unprecedented is overused, but I can say I was in the government I've lost track of how many years, career employee for many years, federal level, a political appointee. We haven't seen these things happening in this way before. Canceling grants that have already been awarded, freezing or slowing payments on existing grants. You all know the Administration for Children and Families laid off 5 of their regional offices, including the one that served California, with absolutely no notice and no time for their employees to transfer their grants to other people in their office, right? So we have that going on. And then we have this proposed tax and budget legislation, which is huge. And I think it's really important to keep that context in mind because I'm spending a ton of time trying to understand how this all interacts together. And it's, like hard to figure out, and so I think that for somebody who's reading in the news, it could be even harder. And all of it is affecting our public sector partners and your grantee partners who are in nonprofits. So I just want to set that first. But our topic today is around budget and finance. All this, I think you're going to hear from Martine, affects budget and finance. But we're going to start, let's talk about this bill that's been going through Congress. I think that's what folks want to talk about. Now, I'm going to tell you the actual name of this bill because you're going to think that this is a joke, but it's not. The actual name of the bill is the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. So if you hear somebody saying that, they're being technically correct. It's like not just that is the technically correct name of the bill. It includes a lot of things. It includes a budget reconciliation. It includes extending and expanding on the tax cuts were in the Tax Cut and Jobs Act in 2017. It also raises the debt limit, which you may recall in recent years has been a big deal in and of itself. So it is wrapping a lot of things into one bill. The reason that Congress does this is because if you do it all on what they call a reconciliation bill, you can pass it with a simple majority. And so actually, no matter which party is in control of Congress, there tends to be a tendency to put as many things as possible into one of these budget reconciliation bills because you can pass it with a simple majority instead of needing a higher threshold of like 60 votes. And in this case, they really are putting tons of things in there. So it's hard to fully describe the scope. I'm going to give you a sample of things that I think will affect kids and families the most and your work the most, right? So just a couple of things about Medicaid, which is probably what you're hearing about the most. And I think that then you're going to hear some more specifics about how that'll play out in California. So you're going to hear a lot about Medicaid cuts and the unprecedented scope of them. That is absolutely true and probably one of the biggest things that's going to affect kids and families out of the bill. Part of the way that's going to take shape is work requirements and administrative barriers that we know from real life experiences causes people to not stay on a benefit when they are eligible. And I ran the Federal Child Care and Development Fund program, the nation's child care program for many years. And believe me, do I have experience with people who are eligible not being able to get stuff because they can't get through administrative barriers. That is like the whole story of that program. So I have intimate experience with that. But we also have hard data that shows that when you put work requirements on programs, it causes people to lose benefits. The other thing that I think is going to be particularly relevant to you all is it penalizes states that have offered health coverage through Medicaid and other ways to immigrant children and parents, to undocumented children and parents, even if the state is using its own money. Now, I imagine our California friend can give more details on that. Y'all understand it better than I do, but I'm sure that's very relevant to you. The other thing that I looked up specifically for California is we got to think about the percentage of the childcare workforce on Medi-Cal, it's 36% of your childcare workforce is taking advantage of Medicaid for their health coverage. Other unprecedented things. Let's turn to food and nutrition. This is going to add matching for SNAP, for Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, for the first time, state match. So think about that. States weren't matching. Now they're going to match. That's going to put a huge squeeze on state budget. It's also adding work requirements for parents and other adults that don't have kids, but even parents of kids ages 8 and above. Huge changes. I'm just going to keep going. You can hear the scope of how big this is, and I'm still going, right? So child tax credit. This is an area that we thought might have a big area of opportunity, right? Because we had so many great basic income pilots, we had COVID relief funds. This was an area in the fall we thought maybe this would be a big area of opportunity. I will say it's not playing out that way in my personal opinion. It's my personal opinion, and the opinion of many other child advocates. So the benefits in there are really skewed toward higher earners at this time. There's an expansion of the child tax credit from $2,000 to $2,500, but 20 million kids aren't going to get that full credit because their working parents don't earn enough money. They fall below the amount where you'd be able to get it. Currently 17 million kids don't qualify for the whole credit, so it's going to go up to 20 million not qualifying for the whole credit. Like this $500 expansion is going to mean like nothing to any of them. And 4.5 million kids who are US citizens won't be able to get it if they have undocumented or mixed status families. If even one parent is filing taxes with an I-10 instead of a social security number, no child tax credit. So that brings me, okay, I'm looking at time. I'm down to like 1 or 2 minutes here. So I'm gonna boop. But I think you can hear a big effect on children in immigrant mixed status families. I don't need to go really into more because I've kind of called it out, but I will say that there is in the bill a lot more funding for detention centers, including detention centers that would detain families. And we know that not even 1 minute of detention for a family, I mean, even 1 minute is got bad effects on child development, and that's been validated by psychologists in the American Academy of Pediatrics. You'll hear about Trump accounts for babies. That's the actual name. Every baby born with a social security number and parents with social security numbers between 2025 and January 1 of 2029, that's specific, would get an account established by the US Treasury and a $1,000 deposit. And then after that, no deposits. I think the accounts get made and parents can put some money in there too. And then the last thing on this front I'll mention, I think is really important. This federal school choice voucher program is fascinating. You will need to look up an explainer to fully get it because it's and NPR had a great story on it. It's a 100% tax credit for folks who put money into a scholarship granting organization that then turns around and makes scholarships, which are essentially vouchers to private schools, including religious schools. So in sum, I think you can hear some of the cuts and burdensome administrative requirements on health and food programs, a shifting of funding responsibilities to the states, punitive toward children in immigrant and mixed status families. All the benefits shifted to the top, even the ones that seem child-focused, like the tax credits for education and the child-focused tax credit. And there's going to be an interaction between these elements and some other elements in the bill, like some elements that hurt nonprofits and foundations overall, like higher taxes on foundations, which could reduce the amount that y'all have to give out. What happens next? It's passed the House. It goes to the Senate. There are senators who've expressed a lot of concerns about it, including some who say it causes the deficit to grow too much, and others, including notably Senator Hawley, who's really worried about the Medicaid cuts. And a lot of senators representing rural areas say that they've got a lot of constituents on Medicaid. So there's still time. That's one thing I want y'all to know. Like, this is not a done deal. There is still a lot of time. No, let me say that. There's not much time. There are weeks. There are weeks to affect this, maybe like a few weeks. All right, I almost got it done. I think I was maybe 11 minutes, Sonia.
That was great, Shannon. I totally appreciate you. And I will say, please write down those questions. I know that there are probably tons of questions that are brewing through your minds right now. We do have about 20 or so minutes at the bottom of the agenda so that we can ask those really challenging questions that we're gonna come back to Shannon, Monique, and Martine on. So thank you, Shannon. We'll transition over to Monique now. Monique, given Susan's very detailed overview of the challenges for children and families, particularly our most vulnerable. Tell us how these federal decisions will influence and paint a picture for what we should be expecting this upcoming year in California.
Yeah, so let me spend a few moments. I am providing slides because it becomes a lot, I know, on the California budget, and then dig into what we're thinking some of the implications may be for all of this. So go, bear with me. So starting essentially with the timeline for where we are. So as you know, May Revised was released earlier this month, which is the update to the governor's budget in January. Now the legislature has until June 15th, essentially, to pass a budget. What we anticipate happening is what's happened over the last few years is that the legislature will adopt the agreement between the Senate and the Assembly. Then the second half of the month, the legislature will continue to negotiate with the governor to reach a budget deal, which will be passed sometime in late June. We don't know when. Those will be referred to as budget and trailer bill juniors for those of you who are closely in the process, which should be the three-party agreement and will result essentially in our budget for the coming year. The governor will need to sign that by June 30th at the latest so that we can start our new fiscal year on July 1st. We are anticipating a high likelihood of a special session this fall in order to basically enact whatever the federal government passes and what the new budget looks like. So at this point, the budget is being based upon the information we have, and we will adjust at the state level as more information becomes available. So spending a few minutes on what is in May Revise in the whole budget that impacts children and families. So 50% of the budget solution in May Revise for the deficit came from Health and Human Services. Starting off was a freeze in enrollment for undocumented adults ages 19 and above for their Medi-Cal services. They are excluding pregnant persons. We've most recently heard that extension and exclusion goes up to 1 year after birth. That's information we heard in a hearing earlier last week. But essentially, this is a cap on services. So if you disenroll because of some reason over the course of a year, then you're not able to re-enroll. And this is coupled with a $100 copayment a month. So most likely the intent is that families won't be able to afford the copayment and then will be needing to disenroll. There is also, which was kind of hidden in all of this, the elimination of the Mental Health Wellness Act. They were about to award funds for 5 years for maternal behavioral health and children's health 0 to 5. It would have been $20 million over 5 years, and that's proposed to be completely eliminated. Moving down to child welfare, essentially the administration is proposing a trigger on the tiered rate structure. So child welfare was moving to a new rate structure like many of our programs have over the last several years. That would have really improved how counties and the locals receive benefits, and they are just choosing to put an arbitrary trigger on it depending upon what next spring looks like. As you can imagine, the legislature has pushed back pretty hard on this, but this would have, longstanding unclear effects as to what happens to the child welfare system. For early education ECE, we saw a freeze on all COLAs, and then essentially nothing on the alternative methodology or rate reform. There were some dollars for administration, which were a little bit positive surprising, but not much action there, which isn't surprising. And then we also want to highlight the Cal Food reduction. So this was actually in governor's budget. Essentially, it is a $50 million reduction to food banks from current levels. Pre-pandemic, the administration had set a baseline at 8 million, and what they are attempting to do is take that back to the baseline this upcoming year. But in reality, it would result in a $52 million cut to what food banks have to purchase foods. Couple small bright points. So as many of you know, California won a waiver from the feds, and then the Trump administration took it away as it relates to streamlining CalWORKs and innovations. The administration did put in 3 minor proposals in May revise, which was something, although there are still some low-cost streamlining and reforms that could be done, advocates are pushing for. But again, this is going to be completely up in the air and dependent, frankly, at what happens at the federal level, because I think everything's back on the table, unfortunately. And then lastly, the administration is proposing to fully fund the transition to TK to a 1-to-10 staffing ratio, which was a little bit unclear. So we'll see how that plays. So kind of expanding on what the big picture is and where we are here in California. So prior to Trump being elected, we were already facing some economic challenges. The economy was stagnant. We were only seeing capital gains growth from 3 companies in the state, 3 big tech firms, and job growth was pretty much stagnant. The state of California was the largest growth employer, which is not real great. So we were already kind of facing economic downturn. Then what we have seen is real impacts from the federal reforms. So tariffs are hitting California particularly hard, decline in tourism, and then just the uncertainty that the stock market is facing. As many of you know, we are highly tied to capital gains taxes because of our progressive tax system. So when the market is soft or going down, it hits California first. And that is what we are experiencing right now. And frankly, regardless of what passes, we are going to have some deficits for the next several years just because of what's happening here in California. Then going back to the federal reforms. So I think what many of you have heard from advocates is one of the biggest threats is if Medicaid is seriously cut, it's going to have staggering effects on the California state budget. There is no way the state can afford, even if it were to raise taxes, to backfill federal funding on Medicaid. And so what we assume happens is that strategic cuts are going to have to be made at some point. So what is it going to be to keep basic services, and I don't know what that means today, for some people, not for all people, for some. I also don't know what that means today. And so, what we are starting to see and what we have seen is folks going to Capitol Hill to advocate. I know a handful of childcare advocates went back several times this spring and only talked about Medicaid cuts because they knew that if we lose Medicaid in California, we're in huge trouble across the entire state budget. So I think that has made some differences. Early advocacy, and Sonia and Shannon can talk about this, have moved the needle with some California Republicans. Also, providing data on the cuts to Democrats have enabled them in hearings and in public forums to put pressure on the Republican colleagues, and also highlights what's happening in red states. I think other big impacts we're going to see is, all of CalAIM, which California went all in on, our social determinants of health, the doulas, the community health workers, some of the expansion in mental health. That is all up for grabs. If you want to make a really good swipe at a blue state, you're going to cut some of those funds. And I think just a couple more things. What things that are most at risk are probably children and families in mixed status households, as we've already heard. So what can we do at the state to protect those families in the most plausible way? And then preparing for cuts.
Monique, very quickly, Shannon talked about a little bit about the upcoming next steps, to make these tough budget decisions on a federal level. We have a budget that we need to sign by June, but we don't anticipate federal decisions being made before that, I don't think. What does that mean for our state budget? Is it going to be a light budget similar to what it was with COVID, where we were going to be expecting changes after June? Can you speak a little bit to that as it aligns with Shannon's walkthrough on the federal timeline?
Yeah, so what I think we're going to see is special session. So we're going to pass a budget. Everybody has been very clear up here. This is based on the data we have today. It is not based upon anything that is being discussed because none of it has been adopted, which means the legislature will probably have to come back, depending upon the timing, in the fall in order to address those, the federal action and make cuts or adjustments.
Thank you for that, Monique.
Mm-hmm.
So we are now going to transition over to Martine. We've heard federal, state, and I appreciate, Monique, you sharing the bright spots. I think that is important. I feel like when we hear from Martine, we're gonna also hear some bright spots, but I also feel like this is where it's gonna get very real for us in terms of how these decisions are gonna translate as it pertains to like impacts on actual families. So Martine, I hand it over to you. What will this look like on the ground for the families that you work with and families across the state?
Yeah, I don't think I have many bright spots to report, unfortunately. But I think that could be the result of this kind of a convening. So let's take that approach. Thank you so much for allowing me to be part of this convening and offering the perspective of somebody on the ground, although remember that we are a very large organization. Our budget is about $100 million. And so we have some financial stability and resources that most nonprofits do not have, which I'll get into a little bit later. But still, I think we can provide a perspective. I really appreciate the context that was set by the other speakers. And I think there's a couple things to think about when it comes to what things really look like day to day. So for example, Head Start. We've been through some severe ups and downs. First of all, Head Start was on the Project 2025 list to be eliminated. So, since the election, we've been fearing that. And I should say that 70% of our government funding is federal, either directly granted or passed through local agencies. The biggest being Medicaid or Medi-Cal in California, which funds our mental health programs primarily. We also have funding through CalAIM for enhanced care management, community supports, and we do occupational therapy and some other things, but it's primarily mental health. And then Head Start, early Head Start on the other side of the house. So for Head Start, which represents all told about half of our services and half of our budget and about 400 employees, it was on the list. And then when there was this so-called leaked HHS document about a month ago, it was one of the things that was going to be cut in the budget. And there was a big outcry and a lot of protest. And I do think that those protests and, huge shows of response across the country are valuable because they make other citizens aware of the impact of some of these cuts. It sort of brings it to life. I also know that there was a lot of polling done in the states that are at risk in the midterms, and that the Head Start cuts were not popular. So that when the skinny proposal came out from the president a couple of weeks later, Head Start was actually not on the list. And it is not in the big, beautiful bill to be eliminated, although that doesn't give me too much comfort. We'll see what happens. And like anything else, this is just shifting sands, right? We don't know what's going to happen. I was just at a convening of for-profit CEOs. The two big words in the word cloud were chaotic and unpredictable, and that's whether you're on Wall Street, in manufacturing, in tech, it doesn't matter. Nobody knows what's going to happen. And it changes from one day to the next, and there's no logic behind a lot of these decisions, so there's no way to kind of infer the way you might under normal circumstances. So Head Start was saved, and it's already been appropriated for the current fiscal year, and the federal fiscal year ends September 30th. However, we're all on an annual renewal cycle. And so one of our grants ends on the 31st, which is, I believe, Saturday. So let's say Friday, let's say tomorrow. We still have not been reauthorized for next year, which begins June 1st. So that means that starting June 2nd on Monday, we could no longer draw down any funds from the federal Head Start portal. Now, we know from the National Head Start Association that actually people are being reauthorized, even if it's for that stub of a year between now and the end of September, if the program is not reauthorized in the next federal fiscal year. But in reality, because of the cuts that were referred to earlier and the closure of so many regional offices that govern Head Start and other HHS programs, they're so understaffed and they're so behind that they're still processing, things that should have happened. This should have happened in early March. So where does that leave us? We could have laid off everybody as soon as we heard that there were delays, right? Because there is a federal WARN Act for employers of more than 50 employees where you have to give 60 days notice or pay or whatever combination if you're going to do a layoff of more than 50 people. And as I said, this would approach 400 people if we were to close our program. We chose not to do that. We chose to have a little bit of faith that the government would renew our grant, even if not on time, at least in time for us to continue services. But that means that Children's Institute is on the hook for a $2 million a month payroll, which means ultimately $4 million in payroll if the program were to be cut right now and we still had to give that notice or pay to our employees. So how many organizations, now we have a large program, I know that, there are many who operate smaller programs, but still it's only about 750 kids. What happens to an organization that does not have the reserves to do that does not have a line of credit or investment funds or cash in the bank to do that? It's pretty tough. And those are not the only expenses. That's just the payroll expenses, not the rent and all the other expenses that we have. So just to get through this time or to close the program, if we have to do that, will cost us millions of dollars that are not billable to any federal contract. There is never, I don't think, a provision for winding down. So that's what it looks like on the ground. And when you think about this, for all of the many organizations across the country that serve kids in Head Start, it's pretty bleak because some are school districts, okay, they can probably weather it, but many of the smaller operators cannot. And then you carry this over to Medicaid and the other key federal funding sources, and you see the possibility that our safety net really erodes and disappears. And I don't mean to be melodramatic about it, but the Nonprofit Finance Fund, has done research, and others have done research, that the sector is very undercapitalized. And so most organizations cannot, they can't live through a period like this where there's no cash coming in. And that's a real concern that I have. Also, when we borrow on our line of credit, the interest payments are not billable to our federal contracts. So that means that at 7% interest, we're paying out a lot of money that has to be paid by charitable funds just for the interest payments to the bank. Again, these are the sort of little details that you don't think about when you think, oh my gosh, Head Start has been spared. What a relief. Yes. And there are other sort of externalities to those kinds of chaotic practices. So I feel like the sector is really very, very much at risk. Not everybody is as dependent on federal funding as we are, but it's still a huge factor because, as was said by Monique and Shannon, the trickle down through the state budgets and the local budgets has not been factored in. And it's one of the things that I think California is not alone, but has not done a great job of presenting, whether it's the city of LA, the county of LA, the state, of really talking about what their contingency plan is when these big buckets of funding disappear. They talk about cuts, but they don't really talk about the true impact of those cuts to their own forecasts and their own budgets. And the last thing I'll say, because I know I'm over time as well, is that how it affects kids and families. We talk again about kind of benefits being cut, eligibility being cut. But there's a whole lot of people who continue to be eligible who choose not to participate in these federal programs because of public charge, because of concerns about mixed status families. There's something called redetermination, which is an annual process whereby people have to prove that they continue to be eligible for Medi-Cal, for Medicaid. Part of the requirements now that are being talked about are twice yearly redeterminations. And we're finding when we go back to families to say, you know, it's time for that renewal, they say no, they don't want to do it anymore, even if they're fully eligible. So there's fear and other factors that are impacting families beyond just what is being legislated. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Martine. One question for you before we transition to the next. How are we communicating to families the unknowns? I mean, we literally are going day by day, and it's so hard to share this information with families because it's complex to start, but then two, it's changing. We want to be careful that we're not creating a sense of fear for families before we have to do that. At the same time, it's important to be transparent with families. How are you dealing with that?
You know, it's a really good question. We actually had this conversation yesterday about where I had staff saying, you know, we need to make sure that we're getting families signed up for these, you know, benefits, whatever they may be, however long they may last. And yet the cautionary note is we really shouldn't be in a position of making that decision for a family when there is real danger to them of doing so, or could be. So, you know, just like everything else, just like our communication to our employees and you know, who are many of them in the same boat, as was pointed out, the child care workers are often themselves eligible for Head Start or for Medicaid. We try to be as clear as possible about what resources are available to them, but not to push them beyond their comfort level. And we use social media. We have our centers are kind of open and used by many nonprofits besides Children's Institute. So we have community meetings, we have events all the time, and we just try to keep the information as current as possible.
Thank you, Martine. So we are now going to transition. I have two questions that I'm gonna ask all three of you to address, and we only have 15 minutes, so we'll split it up 5 minutes each. And we'll do the best we can here. But what would you lift up as the top opportunities for philanthropy to be helpful at this time? Gosh, there's so many problems that we're facing. What would be your top recommendations of opportunities for philanthropy?
Can I jump in?
Yes, please, Martine.
Okay. So, you know, I think there's a little bit of, in my mind, perhaps a tension between sustainability of nonprofits and sustainability of foundations, whereby the foundations grant out 5% of their corpus in order to preserve, you know, to be sustainable and to preserve their existence. I feel that there's an opportunity between now and the midterms, which is a very defined and limited period of time, to really dig deep into those endowments, if possible, and do everything that you can to support the sector between now and the midterms. There's no guarantee, obviously, there's no guarantee that policies will change no matter who wins. There's no guarantee that we can undo damage that's being done right now. But I think preserving the sector is so essential. Normally, in times of crisis, the government steps in, right? During COVID, there was a lot of money flowing, not just from the government, but also from philanthropy. We were receiving grants from you know, partners that we'd worked with for many years to say, look, here's money, you know what to do with it, get food, get that, you know what families need, just do it, we'll figure out the paperwork later. And the philanthropic sector was absolutely fantastic, flexible, adaptable. I think here there are so many worries about what to do first. Is it the environment? Is it human services? Is it democracy? Is it, well, you know, it's all of the above, right? And I understand the difficulty in sort of prioritizing. It's like kind of a King Solomon's problem here. But on the other hand, without the government money flowing, we are the safety net. And if we don't survive, then there's really very little for families to turn to. So I would ask if it's possible for a group to really support organizations in this interim period. If the midterms don't bring about change, then we've got a whole nother problem on our hands.
Baby steps, right, Martine? I appreciate that. Thank you. Monique, how about you? What would you elevate as main opportunities?
Advocacy. I mean, as an advocate, that's kind of obvious, but you know, we've seen progress, I think, in DC with advocates coming up and working together and sharing messages and data. I think to Shannon's point, more now than ever, we need to continue to do that. And then at the state level, right? As this starts trickling down to the state level, it is going to be advocacy. You know, we've been through this situation before, but we've been through rough fiscal times before. And, you know, during the Great Recession, there were playbooks about, okay, if we have to reduce services, how are we going to do it? And working directly with families in the field to make those strategic decisions. You know, how do you retain services and support, you know, service delivery providers in the best way, and how do you make sure that you have enough of a system to rebuild when the situation returns? But that all takes work, and frankly flexibility right now too, because literally things are changing in a matter of days, and all of a sudden your message or your partner is changing.
I'm gonna take the liberty, Monique, to add like a second part to that question, and it's aligned to your recommendation. But when we talk about advocacy, there is so much, to Martine's point, of like everything is just in danger. For you and Shannon, given that your political policy backgrounds, what would you recommend? What policy issues can you elevate, right? We talked a little bit mixed status families, but as you answer that question, Shannon, as we head over to you, if you can think about that as well. But Monique, I'd love for maybe dedicate a little bit of time for that as well.
So I think mixed status families, right? You know, if the feds are going to start cutting off benefits, if you have one person with an I-10, and then they're going to start penalizing the state. How do we get cash in hand? How do we move cash, if possible, to CBOs or others to kind of, frankly, reduce the trail, frankly? And how do we get money in hands to keep families stable? How do we make sure we do it in the most protected way? You know, that's kind of why the food benefit is depressing, because that's just direct food to families no matter who you are. So things like that, and really talking to community about what it means. I think it's important. We don't sometimes spend too much time in our Sacramento and DC bubbles with that one. I think in addition, direct services. You know, parents can't work if they're taking care of their child. We all lived through that for the pandemic, and it didn't go too well. Additionally, we're talking about folks that are working more than one job. They're working more than one job at night, on weekends, in non-traditional hours, and we need to give them as much flexibility as possible. And how do we retain access to health and basic services in the most vulnerable in our community, children in the child welfare system, and frankly, children who we know if we cut health benefits to them or their family, it's going to have long-term effects on them.
Thank you, Monique. Shannon, we'll close with you.
So I'm glad that Martine and Monique went first. I would really underscore advocacy and flexibility, the two things that they talked about. And for me, I feel like you guys know your specific issues better. We talked about all the issues, but the key question is, for any given organization, like, which one are you best positioned to explain the impact of, right? And to whom, is the way I tend to think about it. And so I would strongly encourage, and we have a lot of foundations I was looking we have community foundations, we have family foundations, we have a variety, and you each have different bandwidths and rules about the kinds of advocacy that you can do. But I would lean into them within your rules. And if you have questions about that, I am quite certain that your partners that sponsored this would be very happy to help you with the resources to understand where your boundaries lie. We have in our membership a couple of funders, including a California funder, that has been doing a roadshow about how they came around to doing more 501c4 funding in addition, but 501c3, everybody should be able to talk about what's happening in community and what the impacts are going to be. One of the things that's been striking in the news, and these are news articles that my policy consultant has been finding and sending to me, is lawmakers on both sides of the aisle saying the congressional actions are so big and they're moving so fast that they don't have time to read or understand always what's in them before the votes, which I actually think is frightening, but also an opportunity for folks to actually reach out to say, okay, this part, like, I just want to be sure, that you understand, especially because we have a lot of time, not a lot of time, again, a few weeks, but we have time. There's like still things to happen, to explain, just to add, just pure explain, like, this is what this does in our community. This is who is affected. I personally think that in the Head Start story and also some of the medical coverage, the rural angle, I mean, I tend, when I visit California, I'll be honest, right? I fly into airports, they're in LA or San Francisco. It's a huge rural state, right? So I think understanding more about that could be very helpful. But again, I don't live there. I don't know all the dynamics. The thing I would underscore about flexibility is I was really struck by something that Martine said about her organization and the size and the bold moves that she's been taking with their finances based on the size. And I was at a meeting yesterday with a Head Start grantee that is not small by Head Start grantee standards, but said that they couldn't get a line of credit from their bank. It's a big national bank, because the bank, no longer watching the news, right, is sure that like Head Start funds are going to flow, and this was not a tiny grantee by any means. But I was also thinking about what she said about this 7% interest that would have to come out of charitable funds. So that really underscores that flexibility. So that's the other thing I would say. No matter what you have been funding, if it was direct services, if it was you were funding, childcare advocacy, to Monique's point, and your childcare advocates say, we're going up there, but we're going to talk about Medicaid, because if that's everything that gets funded, we're not going to be able to make any progress on our childcare agenda. What we're hearing and what I'm seeing my members do is, like, you need to be in a position, if you can at all possible, say yes. Say yes to that. Say yes to paying the interest. Say yes to the medical advocacy, even if that is not on your strategy plan and it's difficult to explain to the decision makers in your organization. I mean, that's what's working. Like, what's working is people being able to like not be in their like lane and to be able to like pivot to whatever thing is coming up in a moment where they see an opportunity. And I'm seeing that in my own organization. So that, that's something I would definitely point to. And the other thing I would say that really struck me with Martine's, she helped me a lot actually think through this, is I believe that people are going to need to support nonprofits. Another example of advocacy, in addition to Head Start not being eliminated in the president's budget, is this thing that people might have heard of called the nonprofit killer, like giving a lot of discretion to strip nonprofit status without due process has been one provision that's been in and out of the various bills, and was in this bill, and appears not to be is not in there now as it's headed to the Senate. Like, still a lot of work to be done going over time. So I think that's another example of where, people's voices are being heard on that. And I'm hearing funders everybody who works is in a little bit of a pickle because of all these federal grants being canceled and all of this potential cuts. Foundations have much less money, which I will say this, lawmakers also don't understand that, because the only funders they hear about really in the news are like, Mackenzie Scott and Bill Gates. And so they actually don't understand always how foundations work or the difference in resources. And they may be thinking foundations can pick it up. So that's another thing you could be educating lawmakers on. But the idea that foundations could just like replace federal grants is very paralysis inducing. So I like Martine's example of like not thinking about it that way, but thinking about it in a more flexible way about supporting organizations to kind of make it through a tough time, which may not look like replacing each discrete thing that might have been cut, but a more nimble way of talking to leaders in a nonprofit about what they might need. I think that was a really helpful call.
Thank you so much, Shannon. It feels like the keywords here are nimbleness and flexibility, right? I think we're going to have to be making adjustments. I mean, just overall, I feel like everyone is thinking about those critical adjustments that need to be made, how we speak about our work, how we fund the work. And so that I appreciate flagging those terms because I think they are important. I also just want to remind everyone, now is a good time to begin adding your questions into the chat. I will do my very best to monitor them. And if I miss something, someone will inform me and flag it for me. So please, I know that there's a lot of brewing questions out there. Now's a good time to do that. I will take the time to ask one other question. The pandemic, the pandemic brought a lot of challenges, obviously, right? And it feels like that was just so long ago. And now here we are again with another big challenge that our families, philanthropy communities are dealing with. What would you say? I mean, there were some lessons learned from the pandemic. I feel like for what we're dealing with now, the importance of collaboration, bringing community, philanthropy, non-traditional partners to the table to work together is more critical than ever. Challenge is again, how do we do it in the short amount of time? And so I wonder if one of you guys would like to take a stab at thinking about trying hard to find some positives into this very difficult situation that we're in. For me, I feel like it could be collaboration. Are there any sparks of opportunity that you feel are important that we should take advantage of creating stronger networks, for example, being nimble, adjusting a bit more? So let me pause there for any, I know that's a beast of a question as we're dealing with all these challenges, but wonder if there's any positives that we can think about or that we feel we're gonna be stronger because of this challenging situation.
I have an example.
Please.
Oh, did you? Okay. I am thinking back, it's not to COVID specifically, although I think that all the flexibility that people showed during COVID is where we can really learn right now. I am thinking back to some things that happened really during the first Trump administration around immigration. And during that time, there were a couple of coalitions nationally that were founded. One is the Protecting Immigrant Families Coalition, which was a national coalition established across immigration rights groups, and I'm sure many leaders in California were involved, and poverty, you know, elimination groups and children's groups to talk about how to preserve access to benefits and to fight the, I think Martine, somebody talked about public charge, to work on that issue. And so that group was established then, and it's stayed, right, and is now like it's become a part of the infrastructure. Came about during hard times and is stayed in as part of the infrastructure. And the other group I would lift up similarly is the Children Thrive Action Network, which is another partnership run by National Immigration Law Center for Law and Social Policy, and it's specifically focused around kids and the school impact, the childcare impact, the psychological impact on families of some of the things that have been going on in the immigration space. Again, it's from the previous very difficult time, but thank goodness people kept funding it and kept it going, you know, through what appeared to be a less traumatic time, because they are doing heroic work right now. So I think that those are an example. And on the funder side, I'll share my graphic that I brought. Hold on, if you don't mind, I'll share and put it up. We use, and I have heard that at least one of the collaboratives here has used this graphic from USC around social change. I'm trying to get it to take the whole screen, but it's lagging on me. There you go. As a way for funders, we use this at our Early Child Funders Collaborative to talk about together how they're working across everyone to fund the whole social change ecosystem and a whole movement ecosystem. And we find it helps collaboration because people can sit at the table together. In our case, it's funders. Could be, I think it wasn't developed necessarily only for funders, to kind of divvy up like different parts and to really analyze where across a whole movement or across your community, some kind of change you're making, some kind of group you're trying to bolster, where your funding might be strong collaboratively, where you might be not strong and you need some people to step up and fill in some gaps. We can send it out after, but I understand you guys have used this in some context before. And I just want to say it also works in that context with so many foundations on the phone.
Thank you, Shannon. I appreciate that. It also reminds me of Martine's comment earlier of local governments needing tools to develop those contingency plans. I feel like this graph could be helpful and a good example of tools that are available to begin these very complicated conversations, but that are absolutely critical. So thank you so much for sharing. Our wonderful friend, Wendy Guerin, she's wondering how NGOs are approaching strategic planning in this turbulent and unpredictable time. So again, going back to the resource you just shared, Shannon, I think that that's a good way, but I wonder if anyone is interested in jumping in on that question. How are NGOs approaching strategic planning in these turbulent and unpredictable times? Martine, do you want to take a stab at that?
Sure. Thank you, Wendy, for that question. As it turns out, we were due for a refresh of our strategic plan, and we started the work this winter. And at my board meeting in February, my board said, "What? Like strategic planning now? Are you crazy?" They didn't say, "Are you crazy?" But they probably thought it. And I gave this speech about how, you have to really continue to think about opportunity and we'll get through these times. And, we can't think narrowly just about survival. And then, about 2 months later, my staff came to me and said, we would like stop. We cannot do this. If we're contemplating, having to let go of 400 people, we cannot be thinking about, expansively about all these wonderful things. So what we did was we did a certain amount of work. We did a landscape analysis to the extent that we could. We did a lot of internal work, and we're pausing over the summer. And so what we're doing specifically, as I said to the board, our budget for next year and our fiscal year starts July 1, is really, it looks like an annual budget, but it's really a first quarter budget because we do not know what's happening with this federal budget. We may not even know by September 30th, but as we've said now multiple times, it's just a total crapshoot. So our best guess is what is in our budget for next year. All of the work that we've done has really helped us to think about ideating and to relate it to the earlier question about the pandemic. I mean, I think the silver lining was there was a lot of innovation. We pivoted to telehealth overnight. We did distance learning for 2-year-olds, suddenly, it wasn't every day, it was once a week, but still pretty amazing that 2-year-olds could adapt to that, right? And parents, helping them figure out how to spend time with their kids at home and try to replicate what might happen in school and all of that. So I do think that if you can get your head out of worrying and existential dilemmas, it is a time for innovation, but that's a big if. And as I said, our workforce very much resembles the families we serve. People live in mixed households. They are, many of them from immigrant families. And even if they are secure in their, citizenship status or whatever, everybody is impacted by this. And so I'm not sure if I really have an answer. It's kind of the both and. You're sort of in survival mode and thinking about sustainability, but also thinking hard about what at your essence is it that you really do? What can you let go of? how can you make your staff feel a little bit like there's a little bit more breathing room and opportunity to think about innovation. So
Thank you, Martine. Shannon, Monique, not sure if either one of you want to take a stab at that question as well. I'm happy to move on to the second question. We're good. Okay. Our friend Shantae Armstrong, looking for clarity on what funding opportunities are there for nonprofits who focus on marginalized youth and child welfare in this environment. And I also want to acknowledge there was a similar question up above in the chat that asked a very similar question on that. So who would like to take a stab on that? And I'm happy to repeat the question again. So they're asking for clarity on what funding opportunities are available for nonprofits who focus on marginalized youth and child welfare in this environment. And that's also a very difficult question. But Monique, I see you trying to chime in.
I mean, there's not a lot of new money coming in at the state level, right? I think they're trying to do more hold on resources at this point. So I think this is also a place where we need advocacy to talk about what the impacts are going to be on this population. And I think when we talk about those populations who need the most support, we need to lift this voice up as well. And it's not just per se, children and families. It's also those youth who haven't been supported in the system.
Anybody else want to take a stab at that question? Okay. And I agree with Monique. I feel like it is so difficult to try to be innovative and think of like new dollars. Feels like the big lift right now is safeguarding, protecting, working with what we have, which is very unfortunate because I'd like to think that we have made some progress. And how do we keep that momentum going? Right. And so it's not the way I like to, I take a stab at just answering that question is potentially no new dollars right now from philanthropy or the state. Maintain what we have because we will rebound and we want to be prepared for that rebound when it happens. So it's a little bit of a wait and see and a sit tight approach in the meantime. Let's see, from Casey. I'm curious about what philanthropy can do to support staff's well-being during these turbulent times. Amen to that. Before I open it up for you all to chime in, I can't help and think of our dear friend Angelica Salas at Chila. She's constantly reminding us of the struggles that her staff is experiencing, the burnout. They were burned out before this, and then now this added stress of are we going to continue to do the work? How do we do our work when we don't know what's going to happen in 3-4 weeks? So that is a very real question. And again, I want to call out our friend Angelica Achidla, sending our love to her. And I know that resonates across. Martine, would you like to take a stab at this one?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's so many things I think about. My friend Bill Resnick, who I think is on this call, who has a retreat center and makes retreats in Big Bear available to staff of nonprofits, to line staff as well as management staff, as a way of recognizing the incredible amount under normal circumstances that that staff kind of live through vicarious trauma and in these jobs, and it's just relentless, right? Having to kind of hold up the world for people where the world is falling apart. So even more so during these times, unconventional things like retreats, I think, are really healing and important and deserve philanthropic support. I think also, we saw after the fires, I mean, fortunately, my organization wasn't directly impacted by the fires in LA just because of where we're located, and very few of our staff were directly impacted. But colleagues of mine who were in those areas and the few staff we have that were directly impacted really needed a lot of flexibility in their scheduling and flexible funding to be able to, again, sort of cash flow issues until the insurance payment comes through or whatever. So I think what staff want is a little bit of peace, a little bit of like foot off the gas to give them a moment, some time and space and flexibility is probably what they want the most. But I would love to go back and ask them more specifically.
I have a few things I would mention based on, obviously we're not a direct service organization, so Martine has much more insight into what people need in her organization and direct service. But some things that we've been hearing and thinking about, one is we have a lot of conversations all the time with foundations, and I think that people have been in a bit of a very intentional decision making about like, how often do I call grantees? How often do I talk to them? Like, they're very busy. I don't want to burden them, right? Do we have convenings for them to talk to each other? Do we not? And I think that's so on the convenings, I think it's a little hard because I heard folks in some nonprofits originally being like, yes, they called us together. And then I heard folks saying, I get grants from 4 or 5 people. And the first one was great because I got to decompress with colleagues. And after that, I can't go to all of them. And I feel like I should show up if it's my funder. So I think you have to listen hard and know your grantees. On the calling people, though, I heard a few of my foundations said, I don't have any more money. And so calling people when I don't have money, I don't know, should I not? And I would say unequivocally yes, on a human to human level, like what we've been hearing. Martine and Sonia, you guys have funders, you can tell me, and if you disagree, just disagree publicly. It's fine, I don't care. It's fine with me if you disagree, but like, I hear people like wanting relationship, right? And so and the people who are nonprofit leaders understand if the whole budget has been spent out for the year, but want an opportunity just to like be in partnership and tell the reality of what's happening, and so a call to check in is fine, even if you don't have more budget this year or whatever. And so that has been my advice based on what I've heard from nonprofit leadership. Sonia, yes?
100%.
Okay.
A
So I
hundred.
wouldn't be afraid to call. And the other thing that I think has been interesting, because we have one pooled fund where we re-grant, and we talked about this in the context of some money we were putting out within the pooled fund, was wellness money. And people saying, and again, we talked to some EDs about this, sometimes it helps to designate wellness money as wellness money, because in the face of a lot of other cuts, it's very hard to maintain wellness money, whether it's for like a retreat or a staff party or a staff outing or mental health support or whatever kinds of things that the leadership and the staff think they need. I mean, if everything else is getting cut, it's very hard to like make a discretionary decision to hold on to that stuff. So like for anybody who's on a board, I bet there's some of you in the foundation world, like knowing that that's hard to hold on to that stuff and helping your EDs hold on to that stuff. And then if you're making grants, some EDs said it helps if the grant does, actually this is the one time it helps to designate, but maybe you ask in advance, would it help you if I designated this? Or is it better not to? That was some advice that we heard.
I absolutely love and appreciate that, Shannon. And again, I agree with everything you shared. I'll add 2 more items that I think were kind of sprinkled in your comments. I feel like, yes, do not shy away on checking in on your nonprofit partners on the ground doing the work. For the reasons Martine just shared, it's so important to know that we have the support of our funder partners. I think it's also important to work in collaboration and look at our partners as thought partners on advocacy issues. That's so important, right? Like for you, Shannon, you're hearing the latest and greatest. It takes a little bit longer for us to get that information here in California and LA. So just being intentional of sharing information so we can be proactive, strategic, methodical on how we're going to collaborate, do the work. Also providing spaces, and I do get it. I mean, it is exhausting and some folks feel like they need arm's length, and I understand that. I appreciate the piece around collaboration because again, I feel like conversations like this help us understand how you divide and conquer. We all can't do it all. So what is the Children's Institute going to be working on? What can other community partners utilize that her team's developing to share that information so that we can stay focused? But to Monique's point earlier, even if you don't do healthcare issues, we all need to pay attention to it because it has that, it will have that ripple effect. And then Heising Simons just did a narrative change or communications convening 2 weeks ago. And I think that there's a sense of narrative shift, narrative change on how you communicate your work. And so I think just thought partnership is so important. So I kind of shared a little bit more than I thought on that one, but that was a really good piece that came up. Let me see, convening is, oh, I'm sorry. Let me check if there are other questions. If not, I can probably jump onto a policy related question, Monique, that you are probably gonna chuckle on when I ask it. Rainy day funds. I know it's not enough. And you talked about how if these actions come up with Medicaid, I mean, we just have a huge problem in front of us. And rainy day fund resources were utilized during the pandemic. They were drawn down. Can you speak a little bit more on rainy day fund opportunities? How much could that potentially cover, if anything?
So ballpark, we pulled down about half of our rainy day fund savings in last budget year over a 2-year strategy. So we put billions aside. We did a really great job actually as a state and had a good reserve. And so we pulled down half last year. They are not tapping into it this year because I think there's anxiety about what's still to come. But what is pretty clear is there are some larger changes needed when things turn around. And I know that it was a priority in governor's January budget, and I know that leadership has been talking about it, about increasing rainy day fund savings accounts. We just are seeing more boom and bust with really big moments. And like we saw during the pandemic with huge returns that sometimes came true, sometimes didn't fully come to full thought. And then also just looking at super wonky, but if you follow the GAN limit, and essentially, some older reforms that are in place and tied to Prop 13 is lightly impacting those as possible to actually get it through. But it will get pulled down in the near future. There's not a ton left. I think going back to a couple of comments of, we've been here before. We've made these cuts. It's also an opportunity there's been structural reform so many of us have been working on to reduce barriers in different systems, sometimes tying back to frankly even in just racist roots. And so it is an opportunity to really get in and cut some of those obstacles in our services. As we defund and do things. And so when we rebuild, these services are much more available, friendly to users, supportive, and direct services that actually help people even more. So, it is an opportunity to make some of those changes as we undergo cuts.
Well, thank you for not laughing out loud and that question. Trying to just try to pull where we possibly can, right? So thank you for that. So we are just about getting ready to wrap up. We're going to transition now to just final thoughts. What are some final thoughts, and what do you each want to leave us with as a major takeaway? And I know we talked a lot about that already, but what would be your biggest takeaway that you want to make sure that we walk away with? I know we talked a little bit about preserving nonprofit sector, advocacy and flexibility. Let me pause there if there's just any thoughts on that piece. We will get through this.
I would say, and some of it is really sort of about messaging. this is about the workforce, right? This is about the workforce of tomorrow. That is the messaging that seems to appeal to the business community, right? You know, you talk about kids and they think that's too sentimental. I don't, whatever. But this is about our workforce that has already been set back by COVID and by all the learning loss and by the grief and loss that our kids have experienced at a disproportionate rate, watching their caregivers die and be sick and not be able to isolate and all of that. And so I think it's an appeal to the future. When we think about preserving these services, it's not to keep us in business, right? It's to provide that foundation piece for families that and children who are born into zip codes not of their choosing, but where the life expectancy is significantly shorter and the health outcomes are poorer and the educational outcomes are poorer, right? So we want to provide whatever it takes for children to thrive and for families to thrive so they can be productive members of society, not just for the moral imperative, but for the economic imperative as well. And I think that's part of the advocacy messaging. And I think that's really the reason that we're here is for the next generation.
Martine, thank you so much. I think that's definitely going to be one of my biggest takeaways, right? When we talk about collaboration, we talk about philanthropy, community, public agencies. And I think it's important to also call out business as well as a non-traditional partner important to these conversations. I will make a quick plug. We're proud to see business continuing to stand strong on the state's budgets around early care and education, and where it feels like the momentum continues to happen even after the pandemic, where business is leaning in and saying these investments are critical. And you're right. You remind us that having business in these tables is also important, especially when we think about contingency plans, because this does affect their workforce. This does affect the employees and not having access to the care that's required in order to be part of the workplace, particularly for women and particularly for women of color. So thank you for flagging that. That's a great takeaway that you shared with us. Monique, Shannon, any major takeaways, any aha moments from today's conversations that you're excited about?
Well, I have a lot of ahas. I took some notes, so I appreciate my fellow panelists, and Sonia, I appreciate your contributions. So I think a takeaway for me is, so it's really easy to become overwhelmed by the scope of things that are going wrong. Like that is really easy to do. And then we know that being overwhelmed like that is actually a barrier to action, right? Like if you get overwhelmed and you think that there's so many things going wrong, you're like, well, what can I possibly do about this? It's so big, it's beyond my ability to affect. And I would just encourage everybody to take whatever practices you can to learn to not fall into that mental trap, because we know that everybody, wherever they sit, can do something to help with all of the things that we've been talking about today, right? And so, for example, for me, when I was thinking about this, I was like, okay, where have we seen advocacy working, right? And even like I always try to remember that, like I really believe in trying to, advocacy and systems change. I also believe, and I've been doing some presentations as part of the 1 in 4 Children Initiative, which is a philanthropic initiative around immigrant children and families. And if you guys haven't been on one of the presentations that we've been doing with Grant Makers for Children, for Immigrants and Refugees yet, you should try to get on it. But one of the things we've been thinking about there is, yeah, there's no denying there's already kids hurting, but alleviate like one more kid feeling like they can come home safe with mom and dad there, right? One more teacher like knowing what to do, right? Like we can do things like, and the reason that I feel this way is because when I'm with any grantees, like they keep going, right? And they find joy. And I was with a nonprofit leader who's amazing. And I don't know if she would say this on a big Zoom, so I won't say, but she works along the border, was talking about her program with families. and they were trying to decide whether to have an event where a lot of families would come together or not, if it was the right moment, the right time. And the family said, yes, they wanted it. They wanted to be together and they wanted to have this joyful event to celebrate their kids, right? So that I think of things like that. And then I'm like, okay, and what am I going to do today? Right. And so, it might be different for each person, but I'd encourage you to find that thing and then think about these ideas we have and which one you can work on.
Beautifully said, Shannon. Thank you so much, Monique.
I think grounding ourselves and why we're doing it, right? As both have said, like this is what we've been doing for a long time, right? And it's a good time to take that moment to reground ourselves. And in those moments of where I've had my one dose of national news and I can't take any more today, because I now dose out my NPR listening. I think remembering again, one step in front of the other. It looks different and it is going to bring opportunities, and we, sometimes need to focus on that, on the small wins and the opportunities to collaborate and learning different things. Like I've learned some amazing stuff from my colleagues who are doing DEC advocacy, because that's not really what I do. But we continue to grow, and why we're doing it. We're doing it for kids and families and grounding ourselves there.
Thank you so much, Monique. Key, I think, takeaways that I just picked up on the conversations I think are important, and potential next steps, as we could think about doing our work after this call. Things that come out that I feel resonated from this call are, preserving the nonprofit sector. Martine reminding us we are the safety net, right? Local governments beginning to develop contingency plans. Oh my God, absolutely. We should have been doing that already. Advocacy and flexibility, direct services, access to health and basic needs, philanthropy providing flexible supports to grantees, particularly as we approach midterms. I think that's an excellent flag. There's a gap there, I think, that we can be laser focused on. And good advice on philanthropy to make adjustments, again, especially taking those baby steps, like one piece at a time, 2 weeks at a time, however it is that we need to operate so that we can get and weather this storm. And more importantly, taking care of ourselves. I think it is so important to end with that. So I just want to thank Martine, Monique, Shannon. Thank you for hanging out with us. Thank you for your thoughts, ideas, for all of our partners that joined us today. Please join me in a virtual round of applause for our panelists, as well as the partnership, the Center for Strategic Partnership and SoCal Grant Makers, for making this critical space that I love that we're promoting it as education for action. This is how we learn what roles we play. So thank you so much for your time. You all have a great day and be well. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.